When it comes to spending money on something related to games, you can never be 100% certain that you're going to get your money's worth. This is an industry that can often encourage people to spend money on things that maybe don't deserve a purchase, and at some point or another, we've all been guilty of having done just that. Here, we're going to talk about a few such examples. Loot boxes. It makes sense to begin with the most obvious pick, right? Over the last decade or so, microtransactions have in games become normalized, and loot boxes, sadly, remain a prevalent form of in-game monetization. From FIFA to Overwatch to Forza Motorsport 7, there have been a number of examples of games that have implemented loot boxes and often pushed players to spending money on them to varying degrees. Time skips. If you've played mobile games for a decent chunk of time, you've obviously encountered paid time skips and may even have shelled out some cash on them. It's a classic monetization tactic when it comes to mobile games in particular, with gameplay mechanics being tied to timers to ask players to wait for long periods of time before being able to play more, or alternatively, spending money to skip that wait. It's blatantly scummy, but sadly, it's also extremely widespread. Aggressive in-game microtransactions. Loot boxes are easily one of the worst possible form of in-game monetization, but more than a few times, games have found a way to be all too aggressive with their microtransactions even without the use of loot boxes. A recent example was Gran Turismo 7, which not only saw a significant markup in vehicles' prices from GT Sport, but would also go on to decrease in-game rewards, pushing players to spend more money. Polyphony Digital has started working on addressing the widespread criticism that this has led to, but it remains to be seen whether that'll bear any fruit. More importantly, it's emblematic of a problem that's far too common in the industry. Save slots. Sometimes games can be a bit too blatant with their monetization practices to the point of almost being comedic, at least in retrospect. Back in 2018, for instance, Metal Gear Survive restricted players to having just one character save slot, but allowed the option to unlock additional slots for in-game currency that could be purchased with money. Roughly one save slot cost $10. Metal Gear Survive was a problematic game on multiple levels as is, and stank of excessive monetization on other fronts as well, and this certainly didn't help its reputation. In-game subscriptions. When large sales numbers and persistent post-launch spending by players isn't enough for the publishers, and let's face it, it never is, they try and devise other ways to make more money from their projects. More often than not, it ends up feeling a little excessive. Take Rockstar, for instance, who recently announced GTA Plus for GTA Online or Fallout 76, which offers the Fallout First subscription. Both these games have plenty of ways to get players to spend more money, so adding a paid subscription service on top of that doesn't exactly sit well with a great many people. Xbox One KINECT bundle. Microsoft made a number of questionable decisions with the Xbox One in its early years. One of those was not to only bundle the console with a new iteration of KINECT, but to make KINECT central to the Xbox One experience. Or well, that's what they tried to do. The decision drove up the Xbox One's price, all for something no one had really asked for. The KINECT itself was an underwhelming and under-supported device, and Microsoft quickly ended up dropping it altogether, rendering the purchases of all those early adopters useless. NES Power Glove. Nintendo has made a lot of weird peripherals for its consoles over the years. A great many of those came in the company's early years, in fact, and very few of them stand out in memory as much as the NES Power Glove. Not for the right reasons, though. It was a clunky, unresponsive, and just not fun to use, and it didn't help that it wasn't supported well at all, to say the least. Sure, it was an interesting and unusual idea, but without proper execution, it could never be an actual worthy purchase. SEGA ACTIVATOR. Speaking of weird peripherals, SEGA has plenty of those under its belt as well, and the SEGA ACTIVATOR is probably one of the ones that deserves a place on this list more than most others. It was a great idea on paper, but again, the idea was let down by awful execution. It was imprecise and extremely inconvenient to use, so even though it did support a number of big games, it wasn't worth a purchase in the slightest, especially since it was pretty costly when it came out. PS1 Classic. Re-releases of classic consoles have carved out an audience for themselves in the industry in recent years, but Sony fumbled big time with the PlayStation Classic. From its disappointing library to the fact that it uses PAL versions for some of the games, its surprisingly high price, the PS Classic did plenty of things that drew players of well-deserved criticism from audiences. Duke Nukem Forever. Sometimes things should just be allowed to die. Duke Nukem Forever is one of those things. It was in development, or some form of development, for a long time, and honestly, after a certain point, no one really expected that would ever actually come out. But it did, and it shouldn't have. It's an awful game that fails in many ways, from technical issues to mind-numbing design, from horrible writing to awful combat. Duke Nukem Forever is a game with almost no redeeming qualities, and it's a shame that people ever spent money on it. The 3DS before its price cut. The 3DS is an excellent system that enjoyed plenty of success over the course of its life, but while it sold a ton in its lifetime, none of those things was true in the first year or so after its launch. The 3DS was surprisingly costly, facing tough competition from multiple fronts, and didn't have a great many games. That affected its launch, unsurprisingly, and it wasn't until Nintendo relented and significantly slashed its price that the handheld finally started picking up some momentum. Of course, in retrospect, the 3DS wasn't even close to being a bad purchase, but in that early period, it sure felt like it. Terrible remasters. There are plenty of people out there who don't like the idea of spending money on any remaster, period. But shelling out cash on a remaster and realizing it's not good is an even tougher pill to swallow. Grand Theft Auto: The Trilogy, the Definitive Edition, is a recent example, but there have been plenty of others over the years as well, including the likes of Warcraft 3 Reforged, Mafia 2 Definitive Edition, and more. The nth release of a game. Of course, even when a remaster isn't particularly bad, it can still be hard to recommend, especially when it's far from the first re-release of an older game. Rockstar seems insistent on dragging out GTA 5 as long as it can, and with each game, it gets harder and harder to justify a purchase with each new re-release. So what are your thoughts on this? Go ahead and share them in the comments below, and if you liked the video, please subscribe to the channel and enable all notifications by clicking the bell icon to get new video updates. We upload every day and would really appreciate your support. Thanks for watching.